Hey, everybody, and welcome to our show today. I am Liz, joining you as usual from the unceded ancestral lands of the Monacan people in Central Virginia. And I'm excited to talk to my guest today for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest is something that I think needs to be spoken about in this sacred feminine space more frequently. And when I say it needs to be spoken about, I'm talking about me. I need to be talking about this more. And that is this the conversation about the divine feminine, which I'm super passionate about. It often feels really white with an overemphasis, I think, on white experiences and on white European history. And I could give you a lot of examples of that, but one that comes to mind really easy is the prehistoric goddess figurines from Europe are so much more well known, for example, than some of this amazing art that comes out of Africa that is also thousands and thousands of years old. And why is that? That's an interesting question to hold. Now, please, nobody contact me and tell me that ancient Europeans didn't view themselves as white. I'm well aware of that. I think my point is that because a white viewpoint has dominated the discussion of the sacred feminine, we can end up believing and then presenting that this is the only show in town. And, when you focus only on our own ancestral origins, which I believe are really important to claim, but when we're just talking about that, we're making a big mistake because we're not all having the same experience. And I think the sacred feminine is so much larger than that. She is this vibrant and powerful force all over the world. And I think we're doing her and we're doing our fellow humans a big disservice if we whitewash her or just treat her as an ancient relic that we need to resurrect. Because the other truth is that in a lot of traditions, she's never disappeared and her reverence has never really disappeared. So I'm excited to talk about this today with my guest. She's doing some really important work that amplifies and celebrates Black goddess wisdom and traditions originating from Africa. And so I'm so honored to have her with us on the show. And I have here with me Dr. Giavanni Washington. She is the creator of the Black Goddess Within Oracle deck, the only oracle deck that features photos of Black women embodying the goddesses from Africa. Dr. G, as she is affectionately known, earned her PhD from UCLA's Department of World Arts and Cultures after studying and performing percussive healing traditions all over the world. She's a biologist, epidemiologist, and an ethnographer by training. However, standing up for the Black body is her daily personal, professional, and artistic practice. Dr. G comes from a long line of educators, moonshine makers, and medicine women who took away pain, even when the rupture left them with only what they had in the pantry. I love that. She's an intuitive healer with a special knack for recognizing the best version of you. And when she's not talking with the ancestors, she's out hiking with her husband, her son, and her pup, Pumpkin. And she is joining us today from her home in Los Angeles. Dr. G, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so fantastic. I'm excited to dive into this topic.
Yeah. Well, one of the places that I like to start with most people, typically because I've found that a lot of people don't necessarily grow up with an understanding or experience of the divine feminine, is just hearing a little bit about your spiritual background and what that was like growing up.
Sure. It was very interesting, actually. Well, my mother's Catholic, was raised Catholic, went to Catholic high school, the whole nine, baptism, catechism, she was Catholic. My father's family was Baptist. And when they joined, they decided that they actually couldn't stand each other's churches. And so when they had children, we were raised Methodist. And I was actually pretty, God-fearing and church-going, and maybe even a little competitive. And I won awards for, the best attendance, like out of the whole church. I was the only person who went every Sunday. I learned all the Bible verses one year. I won that award too. And when I turned 16, there were questions that I started having that didn't really get satisfactory answers. And more than that, the challenges weren't really appreciated. And so I left the church. And that's really when I started my just sort of questioning and journeying. And then I went to college at a historically Black university, at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University in Tallahassee, Florida. And there's I would say a large, strong community that's centered around some West African, the Ifa tradition. And so that's where I was introduced to Ifa. And while I've never been initiated, it's something that I've accompanied it, or it's accompanied me through. It was my entree into the world of quote unquote alternative spirituality.
Okay. And could you tell us a little about Ifa? I mean, I know this umbrella term, African traditional religions, right? And I know that it's part of that, but could you maybe say a little bit about what that tradition is like?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I think that the phrase African traditional religion is problematic. I think
Mm.
as we use the word Africa to represent a huge diversity of things, like it collapses all the diversity. It's a homogenizing. It's actually a very colonial term. So we
Mm.
just ignore and dismiss the richness and the layers that exist in Africa when we say, oh, it's an African tradition, or it's an African spirituality, or it's an African. It's like, no, it's actually very specific. This specific tradition is from Nigeria. It has traveled through the transit and Benin also. It's traveled through the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. So you'll see Santeria in Cuba, or it shows up in some ways in Haiti. It shows up in Candomblé in Brazil. It's also in the United States. I mean, certainly recently people have become adherents of, we've had global travel, but even before the last 100 years, people were practicing. There were retentions of Orisha practice in the way that African Americans practice their religions. And so it's something that it's one of the most well-known spiritual traditions from Africa, is the Ifa tradition, as well as the people are very well aware of the Egyptian traditions, the Neteru, when they decide that Egypt is in Africa, because often it's placed in the Middle East. I actually saw once that it was on a map of Asia, which also I thought was really interesting.
Oh, wow.
But I digress. I have some pretty strong feelings about Africa and how we refer to things from Africa. So Ifa is a very, like, it's an earth-based, these are earth-based traditions. We have deities that represent certain forces of nature. And that's probably the simplest, the most direct, I think, most easily accessible understanding of the Orisha tradition. Like, as I said, I'm not initiated, and so I'm but you'll see, I've been to Cuba, I lived in Brazil for a while, and it just swirls around you. The spiritual tradition just swirl around you, and it's a part of your everyday life. But it's really a way to interface with nature through the divine through nature.
Mm. Beautiful. And thank you for clarifying about that term, African traditional religions. That's helpful. I hadn't heard that before. So then I would imagine that it was your awareness of the divine feminine or sacred feminine or goddess, like whatever words you might be most comfortable with. I assume that your understanding of this idea of a spiritual force that is female would have come through that, because I'm guessing you didn't get that from the Methodist Church.
I did not get that from the Methodist Church. In my recollection, all of the people behind the pulpit, like the preachers, I don't even know what the word is, pastor, preacher, but they were always men. Not that there weren't women, they just weren't in our church. And certainly in the Baptist tradition, most of the preachers were also men. And then my father's family.
That was what I grew up in. Yeah.
They were all pastors. Like the uncle, the father, the grandfather, the great grandfather, they were all Baptist preachers. And again, it was the men who were the preachers, and the women had certain roles. They were white, they sat in the first row, they sang, like they had very clearly defined roles, but they weren't necessarily in what I would call leadership positions, or in the positions that had a direct connection with and conversation with God. Right. And so I would say that being introduced to the goddesses through the Orisha tradition, Yemaya and Oshun, who I think are very popular as far as traditions from Africa go. And as far as the Orisha traditions go, people are relatively familiar with them. They were probably my first introduction to the divine feminine. And it honestly probably wasn't a question that I formed for myself. I think it's one of those things that you live and you experience, but you don't necessarily put words on until probably I was out of college. I started working with the goddesses in earnest about 8 years ago. And, people never talk about this, but there is a Muppet movie. This is probably when I first had the moment, but there's a Muppet movie where there's a Kermit Jesus. There's a picture on the wall and Jesus is a frog, because Kermit is a frog. So it makes sense that your however you imagine divinity, it would be in your image, right? It looks like your people. And so at some point, I know it's silly, but it's like, oh, wait a minute. If God is always a white man, what is that saying about bodies that look like mine, or bodies that don't look like that?
Yes.
Right. And so I can't pinpoint like a specific moment when that happened, probably somewhere in my college years where I started to say, wait a minute, all of this stuff, something is not right. There's a big gap here.
Yeah. 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 I have not, I know I
There
haven't
is
seen
a
this.
Google it, Kermit Jesus.
I want to see this. I really, really do. Oh man, that just reminded me. I'm total segue here, but I read a book that was all about. It's a lovely book called "Rooted" by a woman named, I think, Leanda Hopt. I'm probably saying her name wrong, but she talks about as a little girl going to frog church that she never found God. She wasn't finding God in church, but she was finding God by listening to the frogs singing. So there you go, Kermit Jesus.
Kermit Jesus, it's a real thing.
I love it. Well, so one question I have, I don't know, I think in my head, it feels important to clarify because who is the divine feminine to you? I guess I'd love to hear you say, like, what is your experience of that? Because I know for some people that come on the show, she's sort of envisioned as like the creatrix of all, like all comes from that. And then I know in other traditions, she's seen as like a balancing force to the masculine. So I'm curious how you experience her.
I think I have two answers to that. I think maybe I have three answers. I feel like I feel like I can agree with both of those points of view. Like
Yeah.
one, it's that she is the divine being. I actually have a sticker on my computer that says, Black woman is God. But that feels almost in a like not quite violent, but a very strong response to just how the divine masculine has been shoved down our throats, right? When I'm feeling resourced, I think I feel that the divine feminine is I don't know if it's a half, but it's a portion of the spectrum of divinity, right? I think that we have to be careful with genders, but there are qualities that make up a larger mix. Everything is not just in this one being. Yeah. And then my third answer is that I also think the divine feminine is in us. I think that we are our first altar. And I think that we are our first touch point for God. If we are made in the image of divinity, for lack of a better phrase, if we are manifestations of the great divine imagination, then I'm also the divine feminine. You are also the divine feminine. Yeah. My husband is also the divine feminine. My male child is also the divine feminine. Like it's something that is in all of us, and that it's a part of everything that we need to really be whole.
Yeah. I love those words. We are our own altar. Is that what you said? That's really beautiful. Yeah. So then I guess I'd love to hear from you how this understanding of divine feminine and sort of maybe your path to getting to creating this oracle deck that you made, the Black Goddess Within. Could you maybe walk us through how you got from kind of, okay, I see how maybe Kermit Jesus, God needs to look like me. I'm just going to keep going back to that because I like it.
It's a great image. I'm just like, oh my God, I just Google it. It's Kermit Jesus.
Well, I'm going to have to put it in the show notes.
I'm not making it up. I'm not making it up.
I believe you. And if I can find it, I will put it in the show notes for us, because I think everyone needs to see Kermit Jesus. But, from this idea of like understanding, okay, I need God should look like me, should look like this body, to then, creating this beautiful oracle deck that you've brought to life.
Well, honestly, it was, there were two main things that happened. The first was that I bought, and oracle decks were sort of my entree into spirituality. Like that's where I sort of took my first big deep dive. I decided to live my life by dreams and divination. And oracle decks were just one of the forms of divination. I'm also a diviner in some other traditions. And I started just sort of ravenously collecting oracle decks, and I ordered an Afro-Cuban Orisha oracle deck. And as I said, Ifa traveled through the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans, traveled to Cuba, became Santeria. So I'm expecting to see an Oshun who looks like she is, African descended. And Oshun was white as the driven snow, just white, like glow in the dark white. And it was the first card I pulled. I remember like throwing down the deck, and I was like, this is not okay. We have to do something about that. And that happened at the same time as the Ferguson acquittal came down. This is another event where an unarmed Black male teenager was killed by police, and then the police were acquitted. And I was facilitating women actually through a goddess process. This is before the deck was even like a consideration, but we were finding our inner divine, our inner goddess, our inner Black goddess specifically. And I don't remember exactly the conversation, but it was that we met on the same day that the acquittal happened. And I just know that we all left that meeting dedicated to changing the way the world sees the Black body. And so these two events, I was like, oh, for me, this is going to be a deck. I want to see these images. Images are so powerful. They communicate someone's information. They tell us, how to behave, how to think, how to value. And we need to combat the just ridiculous amount of Black death porn that there is in the world. And that's how the Oracle deck came to be.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit about what's who you've got in there and what you created?
Sure. I have it's a 13 card, we call it a luxury edition. It's a 13 card deck with 7 goddesses and then 6 sort of concept and philosophy cards. And most of them show cultures or geographies from the continent of Africa. So you've got, in terms of the goddesses, we have Oya, who is from Nigeria, from the Orisha tradition. We have 2 Ghanaian goddesses, Asasaya and Abrewa, who actually come from 2 different traditions from inside the colonial designation of Ghana. We have Mamiwata, who you'll find in the African Atlantic and also in Cuba, or the Caribbean islands. And she's La Sirene, she's known as La Sirene. She's a nurturing figure sometimes, but also she can really bring the fire and to drag sailors to their deaths. She supports the art of the non-conforming woman. That's how we honor Mamiwata. There's Andromeda, who is from Ethiopia. She is not a Greek goddess, as people have been led to believe. She did marry a Greek hero, and that's how that got changed over time. But she's actually an Ethiopian princess. Wow. And we talk about knowing your story and knowing your history, so that things don't get lost or whitewashed over time, and how important it is to know your origins. Yeah. And there's Califia, who was not a goddess from Africa. She is, for that deck, she was sort of what I'm going to call our patron saint. I had a big affinity with Califia. She is the goddess, the African goddess or the Black goddess of California. And she was written about by a Spanish man in the 1500s. Her story actually fueled what was the gold rush of the 1500s. It was back before the maps were complete, and they thought Baja was an island. And I blank on his name all the time, but the man wrote a book about this island that was full of gold, that was protected by these Amazonian, Black-skinned women who only wore gold metal, because that's the only gold metal they had on the island. And they protected the land with the help of man killing griffins. So that's Califia's story. So we honored her as well, even though she's not from Africa specifically.
Oh my gosh. I have never heard of her. And wow. And I lived in California for many, many, many years. I just moved back to the East Coast last year. Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. History's get obscured, right? But California is named for her.
Oh my gosh. You're blowing my mind. That's incredible. Wow. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm having to gather myself. I'm like,
how about take a moment?
That's really, really cool. Well, and then is it like a traditional, because I've seen some of the pictures online, which are really beautiful. I haven't like held the deck. Is it kind of the same where you've got a description of who the goddess is and what she offers you, like that?
Yes. So on the back of each card, it's not like traditional decks. There's not a unifying image on the back of every card. On one card is a full color image of the goddess, and on the other is the goddess is watermarked. And then at the top you have her name, and right underneath is the region that she comes from. And then there's a little bit of wisdom and a bit of her story. And at the bottom we have a call to action, which is her mantra. Like Califia's mantra is live into victory.
Beautiful.
And almost most of them, we're interpreting their stories through a lens of self-care. Like this first version was really about encouraging Black women to take off their superwoman cape. Like we don't have to be all things to all people all the time, and really turn inward and understand that we need to be resourced in order to really to really manifest our divine mandate. Like
Mhm.
whatever agreements we made before we came here, we actually need to be resourced to do them. We don't need to run ourselves ragged trying to make it happen while we're, taking care of the rest of the world
Yeah. Yeah.
before ourselves, to our detriment.
Yeah. Well, and I guess one question that I have too, just in the vein of oracle decks, is I've always really liked them. I think they're I was gonna say fun, and that sounds kind of like, they're fun. I don't want to imply that they're not a real
They're
tool.
important.
They are important and they are
Yeah.
fun to work with. But a question that I have for you, and I've noticed, so I have at least one. I think I've got a goddess deck. I don't have a bunch of them, but what I've noticed is happens in a lot of the goddess oracle decks is you have kind of this roundup, right, of different goddesses from different traditions around the world, and you've got your brief description of her, and then so you work with that energy, and I appreciate that, and then I've also wondered about the effect of that from a particular tradition, like is it what does it mean to put a goddess from one tradition beside another goddess from another tradition? Are we stripping her from her tradition itself by doing that, or giving more people access to her? And so I guess my question for you then is how do you see that experience of working with the goddess versus needing to keep her within the tradition that she's from?
Sure, sure. I think it's probably both. You are definitely, I don't know about stripping her from her tradition, but I think you just have to be clear that
Yeah.
this is a story, and you're interpreting the story through a particular lens, right? This is not all there is to know about the goddess. And as I've said on multiple occasions, as I've gone and done this research, and most of it is, it's fairly academic research.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily going to the places yet and digging in, partially because I do believe that there are still secret societies in the continent of Africa, and I believe that there are things that I'm not supposed to know, right? So the things that I do have access to, I think, are the things that I'm supposed to have access to. And I think that the secrets and the cultural traditions that are sacred, that are not for outsiders or foreigners, have not been made available to me, and I haven't availed myself of them. I think there could be a time when maybe that happens. I'm not necessarily seeking it, right? Like I feel like that would be a path that I would be on, and the doors would open and open and open. But I'm not approaching this work from a place of, oh, you're going to tell me your secrets. Like that's not at all where I'm coming from. And I do think, there's a colonial aspect to this.
Yeah.
Well, there's a colonial aspect to everything, which is that, when slavery happened, when the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans happened, many, many lines were broken. There were many, many ruptures caused. Yeah. And now that we have access, for example, to DNA, I know that in my mother's line, I'm connected to at least 9 different countries in West and not even West, like West and Southern Africa. Wow. And I just feel like that rupture gives me access to the whole continent. I feel like the continent of Africa is my home, and colonialism did that. If there was a gift, I think that's it. That colonialism gave me a sort of a right to the whole continent. So I don't feel like I'm culturally appropriating. Yeah. I feel like I'm honoring, and I feel like when even if I were inducted, say, for example, to a secret society, I would never divulge those secrets. Yeah. Right. That stays where it has a place and a time, with a people and a context and rituals and ceremony. And that's not necessarily for the cards. So I think that they have wisdom that we can benefit from. And I think that they have ancient wisdom. They have ancient, like, longitudinal historical wisdom. These are stories that have been created over time because of experience and after experience after experience. And we were ripped from it. And like you said earlier, it's not only that Black people or African descended people are suffering, the rest of the world also doesn't have access to the wisdom of those stories.
Right.
Like we're all suffering because of this. And so this is I consider this my work to be, whenever I talk about, healing the rupture, they're the birds, is is I see like a needle and a thread, sewing up 2 sides of a broken ribbon. And I feel like that's what this work is.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and the birds confirm it. I love that. Were those crows?
Those are in fact crows. Yes.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So the bird showed up to confirm it. And I love the visual. the sewing together. That's beautiful. Do you think that there's a specific connection between divination and the divine feminine, the sacred feminine? Do you see those things as being? Because I was just reflecting as you were talking that most of the well, I mean, no, Tarot, you've got all representations there, but I was thinking of a lot of the oracle decks that I've seen. They seem to have more of a, I'm putting feminine in air quotes, but a feminine focus. And I'm wondering if you see a connection there.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm trying to think of the oracle decks that I've used and worked with. What I've noticed in my own personal practice is that I have shied away, not even shied, I've deliberately decided to not really use other goddess decks. I just sort of, it was maybe just a visceral sort of frustration with the lack of representation inside of those decks. And so I like, animals, flora, fauna. The Sacred Geometry deck is one of my favorites. I have a map deck that I love. And the question is there a connection between the divine feminine and divination?
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. Divination is like the word of God, right? And so, yes, this is 100% access. The birds are still here. This is 100% access to the divine feminine. So I think it's a mixture of your own intuition and your own connection to source. I think that's what's coming through the cards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Well, and for those of you that are listening, Dr. G is sitting outside, so it's kind of nice. We get the birds here as the confirmation.
They're singing a song.
This happened before. In one of my first episodes, there was an eagle that was not an eagle. There was a hawk that sort of flew through and was like confirming things. It was kind of neat.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, they've gone away. They might be back, but they've gone away right now.
I wanted to ask you too about this background that you have in percussive traditions, and when I think of drumming and percussion, I also think of spirit. I think of connection to the divine, and I'm wondering if that was part of your experience or study or training as well.
Oh, 100%. And it's so interesting. Just this weekend, I went to my first drum and dance class in 2.5 years. I had an injury. I hurt myself in a dance class in September of 2019, and I actually tore the cartilage in my hip. And I ended up having a year later to get surgery. And then I've just been in pain for 2 years in my hip. So it was this sort of a portal opened. Birds are back. But a portal opened this weekend again, I feel, for me. But I absolutely think that you can divine through the drum. And I definitely have always gotten messages when I've played drums or I'm dancing to drums. I used to hear entire songs that no one else was hearing when I was in dance class. Yeah, and I mean, I would stop and look for the singers. Like it wasn't like a notion. It was a very clear, I wish I'd had the wherewithal or the presence of mind to maybe try to write down what I was hearing but anyway, I was just in the experience. And it's why this is interesting to me, because in the West African drum traditions in America, which I think is different than the West African drum traditions in West Africa, I think things sometimes tend to become more strict and constricted when they leave their source. It's relatively patriarchal, and women in many spaces, many women don't play drums, and they're not allowed. They're not allowed, and certainly not encouraged to play drums. And even in college, I wanted to play drums, and there was just this sort of like the women dance, the men are here. And so I didn't play drums. I mean, I wanted to play drums since I was 12, since I was in 7th grade, and at band, and my parents, I came home, I was like, okay, I'm going to play the drums. They were like, no, you're going to play the flute. And we compromised, and I played the saxophone. But from, 12, I've always had this, I mean, even before that, I just have a thing with rhythm. And finally, when did I start playing? I started playing in 2005, 2004, maybe. So, I mean, it was way after I was 12. I was probably close to 30. But even then, I was able to play here because, one, I'd been dancing for 10 years, so I was relatively known in the community. And there were a few women out here who are my drum elders in Los Angeles, Mama Nene primarily, who was playing drums, and I say throwing bows, like she was just moving people out of the way, figuratively and literally saying that this is our medicine. this is, and she actually is also a preacher or a pastor, which I find really interesting. So she has a strong Christian tradition, but she loves these drums. And she believes they bring us healing and community and medicine. And she was out. So I would not be able to play in LA if it weren't for her. And so I'm very, very grateful for her. So my experience in LA drumming I had male teachers, but I also had this very strong female community. They still exist. Mawasi here in Los Angeles, where they, every week they meet, and there's something about the religiosity of meeting consistently over. It's been years. It's been 2 decades at this point, where they bring women together and they go to, hospitals. They play out in front of people's homes if they can't move. We play at births and funerals. We play all the time everywhere. We are an integral part of this community, and and there's something different about a woman playing lead drums versus a man playing. Like, it's very competitive when men are playing, and I'm the loudest, I'm the fastest. And with women, I feel like I'm the healingist. It's like I'm here with my sisters to bring the healing. It's not about I'm the best or I'm the baddest or I'm, whatever. And it's not that men can't do that, but that has really been my experience. It's a very different vibe when all women are playing together versus all men playing, or a mixed group or all men playing together. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. You did. Well, it was about spirit, like, is there a divine connection to percussion? And I think you definitely did. You were making me think of I know there's a book by a woman named Lane Redman who died several years ago called, did you read that? I haven't read it. When the Women Were Drummers.
Yeah.
It's been on my list. I've got the longest list of books to read. And, but I think her premise too is that originally, if you go back far enough, the women were some of the first drummers, right?
Yep.
Was that right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is correct. With the frame drum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Very
and
cool.
It's something that, I think, how do I want to say this? It's such a marriage, the drum and the dance.
Yeah.
And when something happens when a drummer gets on the dance floor and when a dancer gets behind the drums, there's another level of understanding. And I would say another level of like portal opening that happens when you really are inside of the rhythm like that. And it is something that, I have said again many times that drumming on several occasions has saved my life 100%. And it's the rhythm. It's like sometimes it's the only place I can breathe, Yeah. And so yes, there's a connection between spirit and drum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And some listeners might have heard Alessandra Belloni. She's a percussionist. She was on the show, I think, back at the end of 2020. Yeah. She did a little bit of drumming for us too, a little bit of singing, which was lovely. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to go back to, you mentioned this, and so I'm not sure if you're still doing this, but and I think I read this online. So tell me if you're still doing this. You're teaching a course with the Black Goddess Within. Are you still doing that?
I am. I'm doing it in a slightly different way than you probably read about.
Okay. Yeah.
We are actually making a second card deck right now. So the first deck was 13 cards. This is going to be a full 44 card deck. And what we know to be true, like myself and the creative team, is that we can't just hire models. We can't just put people in front of a camera. We've got to take them through a process. And so Meet the Goddess Within is the process through which we take them where they literally put their hands on the deck, and we go through the cards week by week. And we're looking at the themes, the images, the stories. We're really excavating each card or each goddess card to we're looking at themes of racial healing, ancestral restoration, self-care. That's the major intersection of those 3 topics. But we're looking at where their stories, where the goddess stories interact with those 3 things, and then where those things land in us. And at the end of the course, we're matched with attributes, which then is connected to a goddess. So you actually start to develop a relationship with a goddess who's not necessarily in the deck. And then these women are going to meet the goddess. We're going to come together in person after our 6 weeks of being online, and they're going to meet the goddess and actually on camera. We're going to have a luxury photo shoot And it's an initiation of sorts. It's a threshold crossing. So we're going to develop the knowledge, the skills, and the wisdom that each of us needs to walk into the next step of our lives. And everyone's, next phase is different, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But the critical thing here is that the threshold crossing will be witnessed by the other women who are also going through their own process, which completes it. It makes it real. It's like, because I know what I'm supposed to do, you know what I'm supposed to do, and now I know that you know what I'm supposed to do. So there's no backsliding. Like we're all accountable, all holding each other's prayers.
Wow.
Is what we're doing.
That sounds really beautiful. And it brings me back to the deck that you have now. It made me think of embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of what does it mean to really embody the goddess or the energy of the goddess. And I wonder if you could talk a little. Were you one of the models for the goddess?
I was Califia.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, so I would love to hear you talk about like what that was like, because that's the other thing. A lot of times you don't see photography in these decks, right? You see illustration, and that's something totally different. So I would imagine that there would be a process that would happen or would need to happen for you to really embody the energy of that goddess. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure. For the last deck, as I said, Califia was sort of our patron saint, for lack of a better phrase, our guardian angel. And in my preparation, I discovered that just 2 hours south of here, there is a statue garden called Queen Califia's Magic Circle, which was done by the artist Nikki St. Paul, who's a French-American artist. And she has these huge mosaic installations all over the world. I believe this is the only one in America. And it's got it has these totems, these poles, that have masks, faces on they're not masks exactly, but faces on the top that are about, if I had to guess, I'd say 25 feet high. And these totems surround, first of all, the entire circle is enveloped by two huge, a double-headed snake. So you walk in, and you're being flanked by these mouths that are mosaic. They're beautiful mosaic tiles. But in the middle of this circle is I'm going to go ahead and say like a 30-foot statue of Queen Califia. So it's this, buxom, long-haired, she's got dreads, long locked, black woman standing on a griffin. And it's all mosaic, and it's incredible. It's incredible. And so there was, you can see pictures online of the circle, but there's something, we actually traveled there and we did some personal excavation work inside of the space. And we did some mirror work because there's a wall full of mirrors, and we danced and we sang and we drummed inside of the space. And that was, it's a portal. I think most of this work is about opening up so that you can receive the messages. And that's what that was part of our work together.
Mm. Wow. So where's this garden?
It's in Escondido, near San Diego, California.
It's just amazing.
Yeah. It's like completely accessible. It's in the middle of a park. It's free to enter. I think they're only maybe open on Thursdays and Saturdays, but it's just this beautiful sort of conspicuous thing in the middle of this great big, I think it's a state park. It's pretty interesting.
It's really cool. Wow. Okay. And I'll look for that too. And I'll put that in the show notes if I'm able to find some pictures for people, because I want to see it now anyways. I'd like to go back to, well, I think I'm not really going back, but I think that you're already been talking about this somewhat, about this idea of decolonizing our spiritual practices. I know that's something that's important to you, and I feel like you're already kind of speaking to it, in certain ways and describing, especially what this deck is going to be in the future. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about that and what that means to you. And I was going to say why we need that. I feel like it's obvious why we need that, but maybe it's not. So maybe you should say that as well. Did you catch all that?
No, it went out.
Okay, let me start over with that. I was saying that I feel like you've been talking a little bit about, or we're around the subject of decolonizing our spiritual practice. You were mentioning racial healing, for example, and this new deck that you're working on. But I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about like what that means to you, decolonizing spiritual practice, what that means to you. And then I said, and it feels like it's obvious why we need that, but maybe it's not obvious. So if you could speak to that too.
I'm just closing some windows to see if we can help the internet connection here. Decolonizing spiritual practices. So I consider decolonization to be a practice of healing the ruptures that are created by dominant and colonial ways of knowing and being. And so what this means is a return to the old ways, a return to the mysteries, a return to the comfort of beginner's mind, and a return to right relationship with Mother Earth. And in terms of spirituality practices, I think the most succinct way to convey my approach to this is really people ought to consider exploring their own ancestral roots. Yeah. I think this is primarily about tending your indigenous hearts. And so when I do ancestral work with people, which I believe is completely tied to decolonizing spirituality, it's about having the courage, especially in America, having the courage to look in the last, 3 to 7 generations and being willing to find something egregious and harmful. And then having the humility to not want to be praised for doing so. And then having the fortitude to keep going back so that you can actually reconnect with your ancestral roots. And so much of, if we stay in the realm of tarot and oracle cards, for example, there's a woman, do you know the Rider-Waite tarot deck? It's like, I do. Yes. Sort of they call it the beginner deck, or I think it's one of the most ubiquitous decks. Well, it was actually illustrated by a Black woman named Pamela Coleman Smith, who didn't get credit until very recently, like 100 years after her death. And so, I talk about reparations and restorations. So if we were going to give Pamela Coleman Smith reparations, we would give money to her descendants. Well, she was unmarried and didn't have children, didn't have descendants. So I think this is not an instead of, this is an and, if we could do reparations and also do a restoration. So for this deck, I'm considering Pamela Coleman Smith for our second deck. She is our guardian angel. And the restoration, which I think has a little bit of poetry to it, is that we're going to make her a card, right? So the woman who created the images for a deck is now going to be in a deck of Black goddesses. Wow. Right. And so that to me I think that's a perfect example of decolonizing your spiritual practices. So it's not about, I'm calling her, I think her card is going to be actually Ancestral Oracle, and so she was divining through her art. She was divining through her story. She was a storyteller. She was a playwright. She did like elaborate miniature scenes. She made miniatures and had plays, and she would be all the people. She was a really incredible woman. And so I think this is a way of not necessarily decolonizing a spiritual practice, but I think it's a way of, because Pamela Coleman Smith wasn't a spiritual practice in and of herself, but I think that her work is spiritual. And so we are not only paying honor and giving her homage, we're actually going to put her in a card as a Black goddess, in the deck as a Black goddess.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I really resonate with what you're saying about, finding your own indigenous roots. And I think, this idea of understanding and working with our ancestors is something that's been really super important for me too, over the last several years. And one of the things that I think is, I'd love to hear you talk about is interesting. Well, I feel like, Western American culture, we can get really hung up on records keeping, right? Like, okay, if I'm gonna know my ancestors, I'm gonna go on Ancestry, I'm gonna get my DNA done, and I'm gonna figure it out. Or my family didn't keep records, or we don't have those records back past a certain point. Yeah. So now what do I do with that? Or everybody in my family, as far back, were Southern Baptists, who would think what I'm doing is straight up, you can go into hell kind of stuff, right? Like, so what do you do with that? And I'm wondering what you would say, so how do you start really connecting into those ancestral roots, especially for people like in America who may not have those for a variety of reasons?
Yeah, well, this is certainly, this question hits close to home, as I have, I think dreams are the answer, or at least one of the answers. And as I have started, my ancestral journey, which actually started with my brothers, which I can tell you about in a moment. But I have started having dreams about Black mermaids and like mermaid cities and mermaid people. And then I went and had some divinations with with a particular shaman from West Africa, Malidoma Somé, and who has now passed. Yes. And he actually told me that I was the descendant of shaman who jumped off the boats during the Middle Passage and created villages under the water, but passed those traditions on while they were, from generation to generation. And now the people have come back to the shores. There's a certain amount of like suspending disbelief, I think, that has to go along with hearing that. And there are many, many ways of taking that, but I have become obsessed with finding the boats that my people came over on. And so I'm using all available methods to do so. And that includes working with a genealogist. And the reality is, before 1865, many of the records for African Americans are they're just shit. They're either not there, or they're ruined, or they were never there, or they're mediated through the eyes of white men, white landowning men. Right. And I'm just going to go ahead and call it a really traumatic experience last summer. It was summer, I can't remember, 2021 or 2020, where my husband and I actually went to Texas, to Marshall, Texas, where my dad's family is from and has been for like 5 generations. And, holding the bill of sale for my ancestors. And intellectually, I knew that was possible, but actually holding the paper in my hand was very scarring to me. And I've not been able to sort of stop me in my tracks. And even though I have hundreds and hundreds of pictures, I have not been able to look at them since we went on that journey. Yeah. And so this is when I think you can also rely on other methods like dreaming. I think that spirit talks to you in a language that you understand. So for me, the women in my family have always been big dreamers. There hasn't always been like a home for that, and it wasn't something they always talked about, but they were big premonitory dreams in my family. And I'm a huge dreamer, and I've actually been tracking my dreams now for 6 years. I wait, we call it night school. Like I get up at night and I write down the dreams. And then I have a community that holds my dreams and all dreams. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Oh. So, I can try to walk somewhere else. Will that help? Maybe.
I don't know. Possibly.
It sounds like they're right here. Okay, it stopped. Let's see. And so what I would say is, I think you have to become a little bit of an investigator. And there are, we have more information than we know. And it's just, it doesn't look like, it's not going to come nice and neat to you necessarily in a book with chapters and a table of contents, right? It's going to be, I don't know what's happening there. It's going to be stories that are told again and again. It's going to be habits that happen over and over. It's going to be peculiar things that your grandparents do that their grandparents did, Is that better?
Yeah. That's better.
Okay. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I was thinking too of what you were saying about, holding the bill of sale. Like I can only imagine how traumatic that is. And I had an experience on the opposite side of seeing an ancestor's will with enslaved people being passed on. And, so, I grew up in the South. I kind of, my family's been here for hundreds of years. So, I had a feeling like probably there's something like that in my past, but seeing it is a little bit, it's pretty bad. And so I think what you're saying to me, working with dreams and whatnot, like that also makes a lot of sense to me because in that way, I don't want to say you're bypassing that, but it's that you can get a bigger, you can get a bigger picture or more, or like in my case, I can get back beyond that perhaps, or to connect to something that was before that or more than that, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
There's other ways of knowing. Yeah. Right. Like the data and the documents are not the only way that information gets generated.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I think that's what I was trying to say. Yes. Yeah. And it goes back to kind of what you said in the beginning too, right? Dreams and divination are the ways in which you're, receiving your information. So, and I love the idea that spirit speaks to us in the way that we understand.
And I think there's a great book by David Wolin who talks about, I guess, intergenerational trauma. But I can't remember the phrase he uses, but it's it didn't start with you. That's the name of his book. And he talks about how it's in our language, and then when he has worked with, for example, survivors of the Holocaust, are their grandchildren, there's a sense of being trapped or being suffocated or being burned, but it comes up in their everyday language. They're not actively thinking about the gas chambers, but
Yeah.
they were at school and they felt trapped. They were driving a car and they felt, and so I believe that that's why we have to become investigators and really start to be curious about the things that are coming out of our mouths and the way that they're coming out of our mouths. And also I think dreams can sort of give you a really good container in which to hold all of that,
Yeah.
or analyze. That's sort of a bad word, but assess it.
Yeah. Synthesize it, maybe. Yeah.
Synthesize. I like that one.
Yeah. Yeah. I also wanted to ask you well, you mentioned the word restoration and reparations, right? Not exactly the same thing, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that too. I know, actually, I don't know. I don't know where the national dialogue is on reparations right now. I tried, but I know white people tend to get all worked up on that one, but I wonder if you could speak to your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, when I'm feeling resourced and optimistic,
Yeah.
I feel like reparations might happen one day for African Americans, but mostly I'm pretty cynical about it, and I think that America is not really I feel like America is now in this moment more willing to look at the wound than they ever have been before and acknowledge the fact that it happened. Do I think it's going to extend to reparations, like a financial payment to people? Maybe. I don't have high hopes for that. African Americans, I think, are the only group who have not been acknowledged by the entire government. There's not been an apology for slavery by the entire government. And I mean, California has a working group right now on it, but it's in the California House or the Senate, and it's this thing they're gonna meet for years, right, before they come up with even the first recommendation. That's going to meet for another years. I think it's a very complicated thing. Again, I think it's hard to prove that people are the descendants of enslaved folks, and so that's going to be a barrier to entry. And I don't think any of the complications exonerate the government or negate the need for it to happen. Like, I think there's some soul healing for the country that can happen if we actually make this kind of step, which is why I think I think restoration is really important. So I think that reparations needs to start, and same with restoration needs to happen at the level of the person. I think if we wait for the government to make reparations, it may not happen in our lifetime or even our children's lifetimes. And so if we want to see shifts, we have to make those changes. We have to do the reparations. We have to find, we have to, I guess, be our own arbiters of justice and support financially where we can. For example, I actually have a reparations initiative that's paired with the making of the next deck. Like, several white folks have reached out to me and said, I know that like this, we can't participate in the deck, but we want to support the deck. And again, it's because I think I'm very clear that the wisdom isn't just for Black people. I was like, yes, we need to see the Black images 100%, but the wisdom is for everyone. Like, this is a healing balm for everyone, right? And then as far as restoration is concerned, I can just give you an example from my life, if that's helpful.
Sure.
My mother actually had triplets when I was 2 years old, and they were born 3 months early in 1977. So, 40 something years ago. And 2 of them died within 6 hours. In my whole life, we didn't really talk about them. And I think it was after I became a mother where I got really curious about, like, well, where are these babies? And my mother was, she said, I baptized them, they're fine. But we didn't know where they were. She was told that we would never know where they were buried, and that they would be buried at the feet of adults. And so when I didn't actually, the first time I'd heard that part of the story was, I think maybe 5 years ago. And I got a bee in my bonnet, because I also think that ancestors talk to us in a very, like, again, in a language we understand. And sometimes it's like, it's an inexplicable urgency, and they said, you got to go find your brothers. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go find my brothers. And it turns out it's public record. The information was always available. I just needed to go down to vital records. They were not named, and it turns out they were buried in a box together, and they were buried in a plot with 2 other infants who were buried. So it was the 2 of them, another kid, and then another baby. So they were not buried at the feet of adults. And what we did was name them. So we actually changed my mother chose their names, and we named them, we changed their name in the record. So their birth certificates and their death certificates now have their names on them. And then we had a naming ceremony for my family and our close friends and families. We had an actual, like a legitimate naming ceremony. And now they actually have a tombstone that has their name on it. So they've been named, they've acknowledged. And the restoration part of this, my mom says it was for me because she was fine. I think it was for her too. But but what's the restoration part of this is that we name them on behalf, not just on their behalf or my family's behalf, but also on behalf of all the Africans who were lost at sea, who were thrown overboard, or the Africans on the shores of the America who were died and buried without ceremony, without naming. So this is what I mean by restoration, and how it has to happen on a personal level. So I didn't just do it for my family. I believe that like the change that happens in my heart and in my family also ripples out into the world. And in this way, there was a very clear connection.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is very powerful. It's also making me think of, so Dr. Christina Cleveland was just on this show. This book, God is a Black Woman. And we were talking about the idea of, I love this idea of restoration, but we were talking about the idea of reparations specifically. And, really just the idea that a system that was built on white patriarchy, expecting that to come up with a solution to a problem that it spawned is a little, and can barely look at, is it's a little, I don't know. It seems improbable, at least at this point in time.
It's
yes.
folly.
Thank you. That's
Just
a good
call
word.
it what it is.
Like ridiculous. I don't know. Yeah. And so the idea of looking at this on an individual level, I think is more realistic, but also perhaps more empowering. I'm speaking about it from a perspective of a white woman, which is like, now I have a role. Now I have agency. Now I can actually look at my own family history and what I can do personally. Yeah. And I can I can hold myself accountable for that, which to me is much more empowering than staying in a place of guilt about a massive, massive wrong that was done. Because no one person can fix that.
No, and we need lots of one persons to be willing to look at it. And like I said, also be willing to not be praised for doing so. Like it is the right thing to do.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I understand there's a courage there, but like that's your courage, There's a lot of harm in this country that continues to be levied against Black bodies, that continues to be levied against female bodies. And again, back in the spiritual spaces, it's, I don't want to say this. Christianity is not the only home for Black spirituality. And I feel like in many ways we've been pigeonholed there. And when you have a deck like the Black Goddess deck, that's bringing this wisdom and the stories and the beauty and the grace and the fortitude of these goddesses, it's at its base level, it's representation. And that means that if it's possible for you, it's possible for me.
Yeah.
I'm back.
I love that. Well, I think this feels like maybe a good place for us to end on too. Dr. G, thank you so much for being here. And I want to make sure everybody knows where to find these amazing oracle cards. So it's go.blackgoddesswithin.com, correct? And I know you're on Instagram at Black Goddess Within. And won't rush you with any details about the expanded deck, but that sounds pretty exciting. So I assume if we follow
Summer
you.
2023.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so now we do have a date. So that's wonderful. Yeah, and I assume we would check your website if we wanted to see how you're rolling out the reparations aspect with the deck and all that. Like that would be on your website eventually.
It definitely will be on my website. I also do a lot of stuff on Facebook. I can give you the link for that.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, people can join the list, and I send emails every week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I'll make sure all that's in the show notes.
Awesome.
And thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to be with me.
Thank you for having me. This has been incredible. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, I love this
Good work.
conversation. And thanks to all of you guys. Hey, listen, if you are a listener of the show, I'm actually putting these on YouTube now. So you can, if you're just dying to see what I look like and Dr. G looks like, you can come check us out on YouTube as well. And thanks to everybody who's here always. I really appreciate you. I appreciate you being part of this conversation. And if you like the show, you can always, subscribe to it, tell your friends about it, give it a good review. Send me feedback on Instagram. I love to hear from you guys. I'm at home to her. And yeah, until next time, thanks so much. And I will stop the recording.